Good morning, everyone. I'm Z,
And I'm Ryan.
and we are this year's symposium editors for the Berkeley Technology Law Journal.
Welcome to the sixth annual BTLJ-BCLT Fall Race and Tech Symposium.
This year's symposium is Regulating the Machine, Centering Racial Justice and AI Policymaking.
This event explores how AI intersects with racial justice, climate change, labor rights, and systematic bias in areas like healthcare and the criminal justice system.
Through expert panels and engaging discussions, we'll examine how to build equitable AI policies that protect marginalized communities and ensure just outcomes.
We have a great panel to kick us off. Our first panel is titled Where We Live, Work, Play, and Learn: Generative AI and Environmental Policy.
We are so excited to be joined by Daniel Farber, who will be moderating, and our panelists Adam Husik, Alyssa Moir, and Roberto Verdecchia.
Hello, my name is Dan Farber. I teach environmental law here at Berkeley, and I'm also the faculty director of our Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment. I'm delighted to welcome you to this panel. Our session is part of a virtual symposium being held by the Berkeley Journal of Law and Technology, the leading journal in the field nationally. AI and data centers raise many legal and policy issues. And because of the explosive growth in this area, we also expect substantial impacts on the environment. Those impacts stem in part from the surge in power demand that will result from the expected build-out of AI and data centers, and partly from some other environmental factors. So some of the main impacts that we'll be hearing about today include air pollution from power generation using fossil fuels, either from dedicated power sources for a specific facility, or from increased generation on the grid. There are also water issues we'll be hearing about, given the huge amount of water needed for cooling purposes. And there are also some corresponding water pollution issues from the discharges. And then there are ecological impacts, just given the large scale of construction. Some construction sites may include wetlands or have possible effects on endangered species or other kinds of environmental impacts. And all of those can raise additional issues. These possible environmental impacts can mean permitting issues, which come with potential for delays and increased costs for the industry. So I think what we'll be talking about could be relevant to people who are interested in AI and only secondarily interested in the environment. It's also likely that many of these impacts will fall on disadvantaged communities, simply as a result of siting decisions. And so there's an environmental justice component, an impact on equality that could also be very significant. We have an all-star panel here today to talk about these issues. So I'm going to go through their bios first, and then we'll kick off the discussion. I'll begin with Adam Husik. Adam is a lawyer at K&L Gates. He's been an environmental / commercial litigator for 20 plus years, but another large part of his practice is advising on international e-commerce marketplaces about US legal issues. And that's also included the responsible and appropriate use of artificial intelligence. And the e-discovery and IT technical aspects of his practice have also shaped his approach to the issues we'll be discussing. Alyssa Moir is also at K&L Gates. Her practice focuses on water rights, air quality, and hazardous waste compliance, with this particular experience serving agricultural, timber, municipal, and energy sector clients. And she'll be focusing on water rights and usage issues relating to data centers. Finally, we have Roberto Verdecchia. Roberto is a tenure-track assistant professor at the ST Lab, I think that's Science and Technology, of the University of Florence. So we're especially grateful for him to being willing to participate despite the time difference between here and Italy. His work focuses on software-related issues and especially important on software sustainability. At the end of the day, AI is the use of software and the accompanying hardware. And so all of this is right in his area of expertise. And he'll talk about solutions and policy governance. So let me go back to Adam now and ask him to introduce the issues to us and give us a little of the important background to the coming sustainability debates over artificial intelligence. Adam.
I appreciate the introduction. It's truly my pleasure to be here today to be part of this dialogue about this very important and multifaceted topic. And actually, when I woke up this morning, I opened my email and there was a morning newsletter from the New York Times. And the first section included a reader question: how does AI use energy and how much does it use? And the newspaper answered, AI needs a lot of power. There's just not enough electricity to meet that demand, so US energy consumption will rise. And that pretty much sums it up. So I guess we could just end right there. But in all seriousness, let's start with what's a common occurrence for most of us now, and that's reaching for our smartphones or keyboards to type a query into ChatGPT or another AI model. And when you do this, you're not just sending a question into the cloud, you're tapping into servers that consume as much electricity in their training and then their daily operation that's used to power hundreds of homes. These workloads lead to increased carbon dioxide emissions, the use of massive amounts of water to support cooling for the server hardware, as well as significant strain on the power grid. The scale of the problem is very considerable. As reported by MIT earlier this year, training just a single large AI model like OpenAI's prior GPT-3 model, which was released about 5 years ago now, can use over 1,200 megawatt hours of electricity, enough to power about 120 US homes for an entire year. And it generates hundreds of tons of carbon dioxide. And while data centers are by no means a new feature of our modern life, AI adoption and the nature of AI computations are very different from traditional computing workloads. It's been observed that a generative AI training cluster in creating a model might consume 7 or 8 times more energy than a traditional computing workload. The Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory recently estimated that by 2028, more than half of the electricity going to data centers will be used for AI. At that point, by 2028, AI could consume alone as much electricity as 22% of all US households. Zooming out from a single AI model to the entire ecosystem, it's projected that data centers will draw between 6.7 to 12% of all US electricity usage by 2028, up from about 4.4% in 2023. And while we have seen efficiency gains, which have helped to some degree, there's a lot of variability based on the regional power grid. In areas where you have fossil fuel heavy regions, the same workload emits far more carbon dioxide than elsewhere. In addition, these aren't just abstract policy or technical considerations. Many communities, such as in Alabama, currently are fighting proposed data center developments over water use, noise, and power grid concerns and ecological impacts. To give a sense of scale, that project in McCalla, Alabama is estimated at $14.5 billion, including 18 separate data center buildings, each about 250,000 square feet. Nearby residents in this and similar communities are concerned about the lack of disclosure as to power and water consumption, wastewater management, potential harms to endangered species, and other environmental impacts. And this truly does go to the need for transparency and clear dissemination of the energy and natural resource impacts of both current as well as proposed data center projects. And while we're seeing some improved cooling technologies and increased efficiency, as well as sourcing more renewable energy to power to mitigate AI's carbon footprint, there is still a legitimate public concern and ethical considerations regarding the siting and development of data centers. Well, let's go back to the ChatGPT and the other large language model queries that most of us send by the dozens every day. Estimates vary, but it is generally accepted that each generative AI query uses about 4 to 5 times more energy than a standard search engine query. Some estimates have gone to 10 times more energy, but it's probably a bit too high. And given the conversational nature of our interactions now with AI tools, now that we have interactive voice and video modes that you can use, ChatGPT and other providers, at scale, these dialogues and corresponding computational processing tasks utilize massive amount of resources. It's been noted that 1 million queries, which in the grand scheme of things isn't that large in the aggregate, could equal driving roughly 11,000 miles in a car or charging over 300,000 smartphones, clearly positioning end user usage as a serious environmental concern. On a positive note, Google very recently released a paper which discusses the impact of AI on the environment, suggesting that Google has realized significant efficiency gains in its Gemini AI model. The study also highlights something else, though, and that's the need to have proper methods to accurately measure energy and resource consumption in production and between models from different companies, not just in theoretical terms. We want to be able to compare resource utilization between models so that we can make accurate comparisons as to resource usage. Google's 2025 report indicates that they have reduced the energy cost of individual AI queries by a factor of 33 and just 33 times within a year, and reduced the carbon footprint by 44 times. I would submit that this progress shows that technological innovation has the potential to rapidly improve AI sustainability without sacrificing the performance that users are accustomed to. But there's certainly still a place for regulation and policy guardrails that my colleagues will discuss shortly. I would also suggest that another issue, perhaps raised less frequently in the current AI discussion, is also crucial, and that's the impact of so-called edge computing on the AI space. While traditional AI models run in centralized data servers connected via the internet, there's also the case of what we call edge computing, where AI processing occurs locally on a user's own device, be it a smartphone, watch, set-top device, or a personal computer. And with the advent of more powerful and AI-focused CPUs and GPU processors, along with smaller AI models, in other words, the software, the models can run in memory on these smaller home consumer devices, we're seeing more AI workloads being performed locally, not dependent on the cloud or the processing capabilities of a data center. And while edge devices may not yet and probably never will be able to compete with the raw processing power of traditional AI models in the cloud, they nevertheless have many advantages and are sufficient for many use cases. Some of the advantages, for example, include security. Your information is being transmitted, it's not being transmitted to the cloud, it's being processed locally. Less latency or delay, meaning your query doesn't have to make multiple hops on the internet to a server, be processed, and then come back down to your device again. And there's less strain, obviously, both on the internet as well as the resources used by data centers. But unfortunately, and the reason why this is an important topic is it's not the end of the analysis. I'm sure you're all aware of the urge to refresh your iPhones and other devices each fall, or to buy a new laptop every year or two. And I'm certainly guilty of this as well. And programs like the iPhone upgrade program make it too easy to, quote, trade up without a second thought. Well, the drive to upgrade devices will likely be accelerated by frequently released AI-optimized hardware like new CPUs, or in the case of Apple, its new in-house design processors, like the A19 chip that was announced last week with the iPhone 17. So while local AI processing may offload some resource demands, it's also going to drive serious e-waste concerns. And e-waste is not just a problem limited to the consumer realm. In fact, the rush to deploy advanced AI technologies fuels quicker turnover of AI-specific hardware in corporate and data center settings as well. And putting aside computer servers and hardware, tens of millions of hard drives in the US reach their end of life each year, most of which are shredded and sent to landfills. More recent proposals include better hardware lifecycle management, for instance, employing modular server architectures that allow for individual components like power supplies, memory, or processors to be replaced or upgraded instead of discarding entire servers. In addition, machines with outdated processors can be reallocated to less resource-intensive tasks. And I think the same approach can be applied to the consumer space as well. For instance, encouraging manufacturers to promote modular computers or other appliances where processors or other components can be more easily upgraded. Google once introduced a modular phone called Project Aura, where components like the battery, camera, or processor could be swapped out. None of these ever gained traction in the market, but I would suggest that a return to this kind of sustainable hardware design, bolstered with financial incentives to manufacturers, could be an essential component to reduce the e-waste problem that we're going to face in the future even more. And my colleagues will touch upon more policy considerations in more detail, but the regulatory landscapes must adapt rapidly to face AI's environmental realities, pushing a drive for more detailed resource monitoring and transparent reporting of AI energy use and emissions. One recent example is California's Assembly Bill 222, which would require data centers to report power usage and future projections, as well as recommendations to mitigate electricity consumption. Discussions about these kinds of bills are becoming much more prevalent across the nation, which is a good thing. As a general proposition, though, tech and utility companies don't release energy or water consumption data and aren't required to do so. I would expect changes in this regard as the public spotlight increasingly turns to the environmental impacts of data center, particularly in the AI context. With that, I'll pass it on to you, Alyssa, for your comments. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for the insights there, Adam. It's always interesting to hear from my colleagues and partners who are more centered in the tech space than I am. I consider myself a mud lawyer. I do dirt and water work, and so sometimes I don't tap into the cutting edge technology that's occurring out there that is sometimes part of the problem and sometimes part of the solution. So it's always good to hear that. I'm going to shift things one more time on my screen here. So I'm going to pull us back a little bit, just for a little bit of a Water Rights 101, so that when I get into some of the issues, we've got kind of a better framework of understanding how complicated water rights and water resources issues can be. And then when you add the extra layer of the stress and the additional use required by AI and the data center build out, kind of what we're working with here. So many of you may know about our water rights regimes in the US, and many of you may not. And so I just wanted to give a little bit of a background here. This first slide talks about how we approach water resource use in the US. And this is just amount right now, not necessarily quality. But if you look kind of from the Midwest, my home state of Minnesota, where I grew up, east, we've got primarily what we call a riparian water rights system. And that's really because there's quite a bit of water generally. I mean, we have like cycles of drought in that area of the country. But water falls from the sky during the summer. We've got great big rainstorms and thunderstorms. It's just a wetter place. Some of the yellow states there are what we're calling regulated riparian. So that's a little bit different. But basically what riparian water use means is if you've got water on your land, running by your land, you can use it. You don't have to have a permit necessarily. You can tap into it. You don't have to monitor your use unless you're in one of the yellow states. They're starting to monitor more regularly. And as long as you're being reasonable, you can use that water. I'm way oversimplifying it, but that's the basic concept of riparian water rights. Then if you start heading west, we're getting into some more complicated regimes because we have less water. So kind of the middle of the country is more of a regulated riparian water use as well, although more heavily regulated than the yellow states. So there's maybe some more permitting requirements for larger industrial water uses, perhaps for data centers. There's some aquifer recharge requirements because we're pulling those aquifers dry, particularly in some of those heavy agricultural states. Um, the states that are gray are so complicated that we don't really even have a label for them, so bear with me on those. And then you've got the chunk of orange states in the middle, and that's what we call prior appropriation states. And this, I don't know if I necessarily completely agree with this map because I would also premise that Washington State, where I live, Oregon, and California are primarily prior appropriation states. What prior appropriation means is if you want to use water, you generally have to get permission to use it. So even if it's on your land, running by your land, running over your land, unless you have a permit or a certificate from a water authority, you can't use it. And usually that permit or certificate has a certain amount of water you can use at a certain flow rate, certain point of withdrawal, and a certain place of use. So it's much more heavily regulated than all the blue states we're talking to in the East. And there's also two other concepts under prior appropriation that are important to understand. One is first in time, first in right. So if I got my water right in 1900 and I am downstream from Adam, and he got his water right in 1905, and he is upstream from me, but we have a drought year, I have a senior water right to his junior water right, so he needs to let all that water run downstream to me so I can get my full water right before he can start using it. So that's an important concept to keep in mind. And then also there's a use it or lose it rule. So timelines vary, but like here in Washington State, if there's a period of 5 years where you don't use your full water right, you could lose a portion of it or all of it. It would kind of get turned back to the state agency to manage it. So that's our Water Rights 101. Hope you all learned a little bit of something from that. The next slide is not meant for anybody to try to trace everything. I realize it is a little bit overwhelming in terms of amount of text, but it's dated 2019, but it still holds true. This is how we perform water rights diligence on acquisitions or dispositions of water or land that needs water. So this could be used primarily in agricultural situations where we've got an agribusiness company looking to acquire land and they're trying to understand, do I have water associated with this land and how can I use it? And this really accounts for everything I was just talking about. It accounts for riparian, accounts for regulated riparian and prior appropriation, as well as some other wrinkles, including federally reserved rights for Native American tribes, adjudicated river basins, which a lot of the Western states are thick in the middle of right now. California has a new Groundwater Management Act. Well, it's not new, but relative to other state codes, we have the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act in California, and that is really changing things in how groundwater is going to be used in California. So again, please don't try to trace this whole chart, but this just shows you the complexity of what it can take to acquire water. Please also bear in mind, though, that a lot of the data centers that we're talking about are tapping into municipal water supplies, and that's a different thing. They don't have to look at these kinds of charts, but the municipalities, the counties, the water authorities that are supplying the water to the data centers need to understand where their water is coming from, especially as they're doing long-range water system planning, and they have to take these things into consideration. A lot of them have water supplies for the next 10 to 20 years of their water system planning forecasts, but beyond that, they may need to be looking for additional water, and then that's where they get caught up in this web of water rights diligence. So Adam already covered the fact that data centers are thirsty. This is actually an older data center in the Dalles, Oregon. This is Google's. And the photo is showing the water vents. So that's just water evaporation coming out of that data center. The stats that I've seen say that the US has the largest number of data centers in the world. And as of early this year, it's just under 5,500 data centers. And traditional data centers that are not using some of the innovative techniques that Adam was talking about can use up to 5 million gallons of water per day to cool their processing chips. So I haven't done the math on this slide, but if you do 5,500 times 5 million gallons times 365 days in a year, that is a lot of water that is getting used by data centers. I am not an engineer by any means, but it is very interesting to understand the nuts and bolts of how this water is getting used in particular. So this slide just shows some very basic blue pipes carrying cold water into the facility, and it cools the processing chips either directly on the chips or kind of through ambient air work, and then it evaporates or warms the water, and then it comes back out through the red pipes and needs to get cooled again. A lot of data centers have kind of closed loop systems so that that water they're not continually pulling water into the data center, but at certain points, the water quality diminishes such that they do have to release the water, and it creates some wastewater issues as well, particularly with some of the high water quality requirements, and then some of the chemicals required and the filtration systems required to maintain that. Adam spoke a little bit about data centers becoming more efficient, more sustainable, and that indeed is happening. And it's been kind of remarkable to see how quickly it has been happening. But there are still a lot of data centers out there really dependent on water for their primary cooling. Some can use ambient air during cooler months, particularly those that are in my area of the country or as far, Iceland, Greenland. That's where some companies are building their data centers just because the air is colder. But there's a lot of data centers being built in the American Southwest, which is hot and dry and getting hotter and drier. And they can't necessarily use ambient air to cool their processing chips. And then some are using recycled wastewater to cool. That carries a whole host of water quality issues. And some are using colder ocean water to cool. But again, that creates water quality issues for them to be able to use it. So again, not an engineer, and if you want to dig deep into some of the efficiencies and the really cool technologies that are happening, there's a lot of resources out there. But the fact of the matter is there's still a lot of water that is required for these data centers. I thought this was interesting. As Adam said, I'm chat GPTing pretty much every hour, particularly because I have a sophomore in high school and he needs help with his math homework, and I really need chat GPT to help me with that. And so I thought this was interesting. UC Riverside did a study that each 100-word AI prompt uses about a bottle of water, which doesn't sound like a whole lot, but when you think of the billions of AI users entering prompts every minute, that's a lot. And these large language models really do require massive cooling systems. So it's not all negative. I think there's some really interesting components, some issues that as a legal practitioner have come out from this kind of change and increase in water use and how data centers are and companies are trying to address it. So I've worked with a number of large tech companies on their data center build-outs. And as Professor Farber said, there are just fascinating issues that come with it. Not only the water issues, but the environmental and permitting issues from the infrastructure and environmental review. And just the vast amount of land that is needed has kept people like me quite busy. One interesting use case that I really enjoyed working on in the last couple of years was a data center in Eastern Washington that acquired a lot of land because that's what they need. And most of this land had been irrigated agricultural land prior to the tech company's purchase of the land. And that land came with a lot of permitted and certificated water. So a good amount of water that was set in place. It hadn't been lost because of the use it or lose it principle, and had pretty senior standings in terms of when the water was acquired. But the data center doesn't need irrigation water. That's not consistent enough or clean enough for them to use. So they did tap into the municipal supply in the area, but what they decided to do with these very valuable irrigation water rights is to work with the local water agency to convert it from agricultural irrigation to kind of a city parks and recreation irrigation opportunity. So they were able to move the point of withdrawal and the place of use to a city park that in dry Eastern Washington really needed irrigation on a year-round basis, as well as some redevelopment of the riverfront that required irrigation to repair kind of the riparian zone. And that water is now being dedicated to that use. So it sounds small scale, but it was a very cool project for this community to receive as a donated water right. And it was great for the tech company to realize that they had this valuable asset that they could deploy in a way that they didn't necessarily need, but was beneficial. The other thing that I have been seeing in the build out is when I work on water service agreements, which are just the legal contracts between the tech company, the data center, and the water supplier, which is usually, it's often a small municipality or a county. The companies will invest in much needed water and sewer infrastructure improvements. So a lot of times these counties don't have, or cities don't have the tax base that they need or the ability to generate enough capital for their long-term infrastructure needs. And tech companies realize their impact in moving in and also their the importance of their partnership and making sure that their presence in a community is beneficial and sustainable. So there has been some significant investment in these water service agreements of basically just dollars coming in from the tech company to the municipality to rebuild or improve their water infrastructure and sewer wastewater treatment beyond what the data center needs, right? Sometimes it is driven because the data center needs more water and wastewater capacity, but also because they're partnering with these communities. And then the last point that I'll make on the positive outcomes is that there's often the data centers can be a new customer base to replace older, quote unquote, dirtier industries. So one agreement that I worked on recently was in an area where a paper mill had gone defunct and was closed down, and they had used a lot of water for their processing, and they had a lot of wastewater as well. And for the utility to lose that customer means that they lose a lot of revenue. And so to have another customer come in, like a data center, with capital, with the ability to invest, and with the ability to pay the rates of the municipal utility, that is significantly helpful to these communities, even larger cities that need that need customers to buy their water to keep their rates lower, to be able to invest in their own infrastructure and their own kind of climate adjustment and conservation initiatives. So while it's easy to say, well, they use a lot of water and what are we going to do? And those are very real and valid issues. I think there's also a flip side to recognize in that there can be some great partnerships and some great benefits to the investment that companies are making when it comes to their water needs and the water infrastructure support system. So that's all that I have on water use. And with that, I will pass the mic over.
So I'm going to take a bit of a different twist on the topic, which is about green AI. And just as Alyssa, I'm going to start with some boring definitions. Very useful, though. So what is green AI? It was first defined, I guess, around 5 years ago by Schwartz, who broadly defined it as green AI treats efficiency as a primary evaluation criterion alongside accuracy. So as you might know, accuracy is one of the most important properties of AI models. So how well do they output an answer, basically? And with green AI, we're also making the sustainability of these models a priority, right? And so this is the definition, but being pragmatic, as I am an engineer, the question is then, is it actually possible to make AI greener? And the answer, short and quick, is yes. Actually, there are many AI solutions which already exist. This is also something I've been working on for a while. And just to give you a couple of examples, one way to make AI more environmental sustainable. And here I'm talking really about the models. So I'm specializing in software. And so basically how we can make AI models more energy efficient, basically. And for example, a work we did is we looked for the first time as instead of looking at the AI algorithms, so basically at the inner workings of the AI machine, instead of we just looked at the data we feed to these models. And if by tuning the data we feed to this model, we could improve the energy efficiency. And the answer is yes, by a staggering amount. In our preliminary study, we showed that just by selecting the data we give as input, we were able to improve the energy efficiency by 92.2%, which is quite a considerable number. And this was just one example. Other work we did is instead of looking at little algorithms, we look at sort of bigger ones, so deep neural networks. In this case, we looked at how different tactics such as layer freezing, model quantization, early stoppings, they're all different kind of techniques with which we can improve the training phase of an AI algorithm. So basically, when a model learns, and here through these techniques, we were able to save around 50% of the energy consumed by these models. Or again, we just looked at how much different programming languages consume. So if we use different libraries, can we consume a different amount of energy? And again, this is a very important choice. And we showed that you can save almost 100% by selecting one library over another of different programming languages. So basically how the AI models are implemented. Or again, we build upon can we just look at the data to train the models to improve the energy efficiency? We dig deeper into it with some colleagues of Lausanne, I think. And here we were able to save energy efficiency by a lot. Or more recently, we came out with a strategy with which if you have now the LLMs which consume a lot, well, maybe you have a simple task, so you could just use at runtime. So while you're doing a query and you don't need the super complex algorithm, then maybe you can choose at runtime a more energy efficient one. And also here we're able to save a lot of energy. And this is just some works I did, so I am very familiar with, obviously. But I'm absolutely not alone. So back in the days, I think 3 years ago, we looked a bit about what other researchers did in the area. And already 3 years ago, there were already 51 other green AI solutions which were published and peer-reviewed. And this, again, is in a landscape which evolves in an extremely rapid pace. So I can only fathom how many new solutions came out during these 3 years. And so with all this solution, intuitively, you would say, well, then we are heading in the right direction, or aren't we? And then, this was my little field, and then I also got exposed to the news. And here you see news such as, according to Google's environmental report, the company emissions have increased by almost 50% compared to 19. And this was the report that Google provided on their sustainability and environmental sustainability, and of course, large language models and ChatGPT. And here, this is just an estimate provided by Forbes. I have no idea how they get this number, because actually, and maybe we will talk, I hope we'll talk about this, that companies, I guess, are not required to release this information. So I guess this is just a hand-waving number. But yeah, as Daniel at the beginning said, ChatGPT has a huge impact on environmental resources that we all share in this little planet we have. Or again, they're building, apparently, they're at least thinking of using nuclear power to power the plants, to power the hyperscalers, and you put this all together. And I say, well, maybe we're not heading exactly in the right direction, especially because, as I said, solutions exist, right? And just funnily today, I find out this news that Google quietly removed their net zero carbon goal from their website. And I found it by myself, because I was like I wanted to give the example of how every company has their net zero pledges, and I'm going to talk about this just in a few slides. But I Googled it, and then funnily enough, it's still cached in the Google search. So you see that there is we set our goal to achieve net zero emissions across all operations of our operations. And this was, I Googled it today, so this is, okay, eventual consistency might be slightly updated, but I guess maximum a week or so. And then you go on the website, so you click on it, and you realize that's actually old news, because if you look at the search bar, you see that actually net zero doesn't appear anymore. So maybe Tom's Hardware news is right. So on one hand, we have all these solutions. On the other hand, the situation doesn't seem to improve that much from a news point of view. And two quick side notes I wanted to make, maybe it helps the discussion, and I always like to stress this during these presentations. First one is that energy consumption of AI is different for carbon footprint. Meaning the carbon footprint can be a lot more manipulable as a metric somehow, because maybe you consume a lot of energy, but you use the energy of the solar energy in Spain. It was a very sunny day, so you consume a lot, but there was also a lot of energy available. And this is the first point. I would say, well, why not? And this brings me to my second note I always like to bring up, which green energy is not a synonym to infinite energy. So we have to consider that the green energy resources we share among different parties. And I lived for a long time in the Netherlands, and there was a bit of an uproar where Facebook, now Meta, wanted to move one of their big data centers, the hyperscalers, into North Holland, which is a small region. And due to their zero net pledges, they would have taken up all the energy, the green energy resources from all other parties which shared that land basically with them. In the end, they didn't build the data center. So going a bit into a conclusion and open to discussion then is, why are we not making AI greener yet? And the first one is maybe an intuition I have, and it is that we're always trying to push out for this new feature, right? So now the ChatGPT was able to, with Stable Diffusion, to generate Gimli images, and that was the important part to keep up with the market and being competitive and whatnot. And during that period, actually, we were already doing a study on how much energy do these models consume that they produce these nice images, and quickly said it's a lot, right? So generating with a less energy efficient model, maybe, we have no idea, but generating a single image could cost as much as 40% of a phone battery charge. So quite considerable, but yet, being competitive is very important. So let's just push new features out. Let's have a model which is more accurate. Or more precise, or has some new flashy feature that people want. And this is the first one, and this is just a hunch. The other ones came from a study we did together with some colleagues in Amsterdam. And one of the issues is that, and we spoke with a lot of different parties involved into the technological landscape, the state of the practice really. And one is there is a lack of standard on what to measure and how to measure it. So it's really hard to read a clear report and being able to interpret it objectively. The second one, or third, depending, is there is always a law always maybe needs to catch up, because this technology, the landscape is evolving so fast that AI laws are they even there yet, or are they at an established phase? Maybe not that much. And the same goes then for taxation strategies. The third one, there is a certain resilience to change of tech companies. If something works, why should they change it to make it less performant and more efficient? There is for sure a scattered landscape. So the solutions I showed work in some scenarios, but not in other ones. And understanding what to apply when and what the impact will be might be hard to estimate. And least but not last, there is always a bit of a lack of knowledge, and this is also because maybe there is a lack of transparency of companies in reporting their emissions and in us to knowing how much we emit by using their services. And there is also this is a lack of awareness, but there is also a lack of knowledge where I hope in the future we will see more professional figures that work into improving the environmental efficiency of AI and software as a whole. This concludes my little talk. I can stop sharing, and I guess we can start with questions.
That's been great. I learned a lot, and I'm sure that our viewers have too. I was wondering, we talked about the problems that could be associated with AI. We talked about some solutions. I wondered if we could talk a little bit about some of the policy implications. On the one hand, it could be that we need stricter government policies uh, or to for example, push AI centers toward using renewables. Uh, it could be that our current policies are just where we need to be, or it could be, as I think people from the Trump administration would say, that we actually need to ratchet down on the environmental policies here because of the urgency of building out AI for benefit of our economy, for competition with China, et cetera. So I was wondering, I'd like to just go around and maybe ask each of you for some thoughts about that. Are there areas where you think the government could usefully step in, or where the government ought to step back, and maybe what level of government? How much of this should be local, state, national? So Adam, why don't we start with you, and then we'll just go to Alyssa and Roberto.
Yes, and I think a common theme in all the presentations was that it's hard to regulate what you don't know. And I think the lack of transparency and reporting requirements is an issue that needs to be addressed at the outset, and then try to find creative solutions to deal with that. So my answer is yes. On what level and what manner, I think is to be determined, but it certainly can't proceed at this rate, this exponential rate of increasing without public changes.
Yeah, Alyssa?
Yeah, I think it's a really complicated question and therefore a very complicated answer. I'll just speak from some kind of personal experiences in representing clients. A lot of the clients that I work with are very, I would say, environmentally minded. They are companies that want to be doing what they're doing sustainably. And they're running up sometimes against, our water code is over 100 years old. They're running up against some very old regulations or ways that agencies are implementing regulations that get in the way of innovative solutions. And so I don't know if deregulation is necessarily the answer, but I do think that thinking outside of the box and allowing for some more creative use of old laws, if we can't change them, let's start implementing them in ways that are more useful for us. So one example is we have a water banking code here in Washington State, and it exists in other prior appropriation states where if you're not going to use your water for a while, you can put it in a bank, which is really an administrative legal mechanism with our Department of Ecology, and it can just sit there until you decide what you want to do with it. And that was one of the mechanisms we used in the water rights donation situation that I was talking about. But it took too long to get there and to get everything figured out. If it had been a 4 to 6 month process, I think that this particular client would have said to a lot of other clients, hey, look at this. This is a great, innovative way to use the water code. But because of the implementation and the way the agency was working with the situation, it just took a very long time and cost more, frankly, in legal fees than it needed to. So again, I don't know what the answer is, but I think if we can get a little bit more creative, even if we're not necessarily changing law and policy, but we are thinking about kind of the practical implications of some of the enforcement of it, I think we could achieve some greater legal efficiencies and environmental efficiencies.
Thank you.
Maybe if I can add, and law is not my forte, I have to admit, I'm a software engineer. But again, I guess a good starting point would be to have clear regulation on reporting all the measurements they have, from energy to carbon footprint, water resources usage, and so on and so forth. And that would be a first step in then knowing better when and how to intervene. And maybe Daniel, you hinted at it, but I guess there is this sketchy path of hoping that AI will solve the problem itself, right? Which, in my opinion, is a bit of a big gamble. Maybe it will, maybe not. And pushing forward just with this gamble and saying it will just fix itself, I guess it's not a safe way to go, maybe.
Roberto, though, I have to add your presentation discussing the amazing work that you've apparently done with optimization of the models themselves. Perhaps there could be, if it's taxation or some other incentive to companies to optimize their models to reduce consumption. That could be, once we have metrics where we can measure different models across the board, have a scale, a ranking, and have regulations to encourage responsible development, and maybe not pushing for the newest features and the instant video generation, which we're seeing now with the models. If one picture takes that much to generate, imagine what a 30-second video does now. So that really sparked a thought in my mind that the public view might want to look at ways to incentivize efficiency.
Yeah, so I'm not pushing against innovation. I'm just maybe advising for getting a bit of a lower pace of innovation, so we don't have to, burn the planet immediately, but having a sustainable way of doing it to not burn the planet. Sorry.
Yes, well, I don't know. The emphasis seems to be on speeding up innovation, if possible, as these companies race with each other and the Chinese. Uh, so when you said maybe AI would solve this, did you mean that the companies would do it on their own, or did you mean that AI will come up, itself will come up with better methods of improving efficiency, or I don't know. I thought if I'd had more foresight, I would have asked Chat GPT beforehand, about this entire issue and what should be done.
Yeah, so there is generally people who have this optimistic outlook in which AI will get so intelligent at some point that all issues that we will have might be solved by it. But again, I don't think we have factual data to sustain this claim. So it's really just a maybe, which again brings me to it's a gamble. We could have models that at some point come up with an amazing new solution on how the impact of AI and humans as a whole can be improved on planet Earth. But right now, the pointers are not in that exact direction, let's say.
I guess so. Although the companies themselves do have an incentive to improve energy use, at least, since that's an important cost from their point of view, or I would assume so. Is that right?
From the models we're seeing developed, it doesn't seem right. So we're going for these huge, enormous models which need ever more power. Adam talked about hardware. The hardware you need to train and to play with these models is tremendous, and you need to throw the hardware pieces away after a couple of years because you don't have space anymore. And the new model with more billions parameters came out, and that's what you need to use now. So it's not going towards, maybe there is an economic gain that then, offsets a bit the cost of energy use. So that's why also a taxation strategy might help there, because energy cost alone might not cut it.
Yeah, I know in the energy regulation arena, there is a lot of argument going on right now about how much of the incremental costs of building out the grid and the power system should go directly on the AI folks rather than being sort of socialized throughout the grid. But there seems to be a lot of political pressure to make them bear the full costs, because affordability is a very sensitive issue with consumers and therefore with politicians. And I suppose how that gets worked out could have an effect in terms of the incentives of the companies themselves. One thing I wanted to make sure I mentioned before we sort of move on with the discussion, we talked about climate effects and we talked about water effects, but we haven't said much about air pollution, conventional air pollution effects, and those could be a significant part of the policy mix to the extent um, that power ends up being generated by gas or by coal. Uh, that's a contribution to a variety of air pollution problems, including potentially ozone, and then for coal in particular, particulates, which have a lot of health effects. And this could take place either because of just general expansion of the grid and the power supply, or because of dedicated power sources, and also because of backup generators, which tend to be very energy inefficient. And because they're not used very often, it's not generally worth investing a lot in high efficiency. But that also means that when they are used, they could be a significant air pollution source. One of the places where that ended up being quite controversial is Memphis, where Elon Musk has a big AI facility. And that turned into a big sort of community dispute with, I think it's located in a highly minority demographic. Uh, and there was a lot of community pushback. And then um, a legal dispute that I think is ongoing about the permitting for the gas generators that Musk had brought in. So just to sort of fill out I think the solutions are largely similar to the ones for some of these other problems, but just to kind of fill in the picture for viewers who are not aware of this, also adds to the permitting issues, right, which are significant. Because the amount of power involved, you could end up requiring air permits as well as discharge permits, permission, especially in a prior appropriation state, to get the money and so forth. And I think there's going to be a lot of debate about whether we're able to make the permit process work quickly enough. What Alyssa was saying about the water banking could also be an issue with a lot of other kinds of permitting. And there's going to be, on the one hand, real pressure to speed things up, and on the other hand, real resistance to doing that.
Yeah, and I'll just speak to the air permitting a little bit because I work on that as well. Not only for kind of the like what you talk about, the big power sources. So, places like Washington where we thought we were going to be done with fossil fuel fired power. We're looking at it again because of this drive for more energy, and that those are significant permitting regimes that are required in order to kind of revamp some of those power sources. But I did also work on the diesel backup generator issue that you speak to, Professor Farber. This was a few years ago before the AI build out, but it was big tax incentives for data centers to be built, and along comes the diesel backup generators, and there's very complicated federal and state air permitting that comes along with that. And not only is that a process, but they're very susceptible to appeals. And so 3 major tech companies spent millions of dollars in legal fees on these appeals of their air permits. The appeals they eventually got their permits and they're operating. But it begs a question in my mind about could that money have been better spent on more efficient technologies or greener solutions rather than just, and I'm coming against myself as a lawyer, but rather than just legal fees. So your permitting questions could be an entirely, different panel from this.
Yeah, no, that's great. I hesitate to say that spending money on legal fees is not well spent, but since, of course, that's what we're training people to go out and do. but I do
Right,
think
I don't
there's
disagree
an
with that,
argument
but
there.
but could we all collaboratively work together from a legal and regulatory standpoint rather than a litigious standpoint is
Yeah,
my perspective anyway.
right. Why don't we wind up by just going around one more time and sort of, maybe ask each of you to sort of, uh, give a few thoughts about how you see the future developing in this area. Obviously there are a whole range of different possibilities and nobody can be sure where things are going. But, if you had to guess, um, how do you think that these sustainability issues are going to develop or going to get dealt with? And Adam, once again, you're first on deck.
I like to be an optimist, and I do think we're going to solve the problem. I think it'll be in ways that we haven't thought of yet, most likely. And Roberto, I do think AI has a role in smarter engineering and designing data center operations and grid management as a whole. But I also like to see energy generation hit more of the local level too, encouraging banking of solar panel, homeowners of solar panels, installing more batteries to sell back to the grid during off-peak times. And we're seeing that more and more. Hopefully we'll have incentives come back again. So we have tax credits and ways to do that in an affordable way. And at the same time, I'm sure, as you pointed out, Roberto, we're going to see models get more optimized. We're already seeing, I have a server in my house and I run a small large language model locally, and I'm not using much off the grid. So it's a low wattage computer and it does many things for me. So I think we're going to have our personal devices, like I was discussing, the edge computing, handle a lot of the work that we offload now to do it ourselves locally. So the aggregate impact of all of this, of the AI processing might not be as huge of a problem as we imagine, but still, obviously, there's a huge impact on the grid. We need to be responsible, develop responsibly, and the law needs to respond to that. So I think we have good things to come.
Maybe we should stop there while we're on a high note. Alyssa.
I can be optimistic as well. I think I sit more in the trenches of it on a day-to-day basis and working with the clients that I work with. And I do think that there are opportunities for pushing new innovative legal strategies, like I was talking about, like with the water banking. Water banking isn't necessarily new, but the use of it for this and this driving better use of it, I think is a good thing. We also have seen some changes, and this has swung back a little bit because of the current administration, but the push for more energy and more renewable energy led to expedited permitting regimes here in the Northwest to get renewable energy sited. And so I thought that that was a positive outcome, kind of being driven, and also a solution for this as well. So I'm hopeful about those aspects to come. And I'm also hopeful that the some of the infrastructure investment that I talked about is real and beneficial for the communities that where these data centers are being built. Recognizing for some communities it doesn't feel that way, and it may not be that way. But I think for some it really can be an economic input that's much needed.
And Roberto, you get the final
All right.
word.
Okay, I didn't want to sound like a pessimist. I'm actually an optimist as well. So, on one hand, as Adam hinted to, I guess in the future we might go towards a more distributed paradigm. So the rise of prosumers, so people who maybe have a solar panel and run things more locally instead of a hyperscaler, very centralized in a geographical area kind of scenario. This is one thing, and the other thing that lets me be an optimist is maybe AI might be a bit of a hype right now, and at some point we will stop pushing for just the newest thing and start optimizing, because then it would make more sense also from an economical point of view to start to optimize what we have instead of having a future which doesn't do that much new with respect to the old features we already have.
Well, great. It's nice to hear something optimistic. Something doesn't always happen to me these days. And it's been a terrific discussion. As I said, I've already learned a lot, and I think it will be fascinating to watch how this field develops and how these sustainability issues get dealt with. So thank you for being here to speak. Thanks to those who are in the audience. If you have questions, I think that the Law Journal has set up some ways of directing questions to individual panelists, and I would urge people who are watching to do that. Good day.